Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome both in this packed room at the Royal Aeronautical Society and to our global audience. It's very nice to be joined by so many people online and in the room. I'm really looking forward to tonight's lecture by Ole Jørgen Maaø because, as I was saying to Ole earlier, we often hear about the Norwegians in fighter command, but we very rarely get to hear about them in bomber command. So I'm not going to waste any time, Ole. I'm going to sit down, shut up, and listen very eagerly and with anticipation. So please take it away.
Thank you very much. Dear audience, thank you for coming, and also to the people on the internet. Thank you also to the RAF Museum for inviting me here to give this lecture. I hope you will be happy also afterwards. During all the major and big events during the Second World War, there was a small event or a regular event occurring on the 22nd of November 1942. On that evening, the men of 76 Squadron stationed at Linton on Ouse in North Yorkshire participated in one of their attacks on Germany, this time on Stuttgart in the southwestern parts of Germany. There was a total of 222 bombers attacking Stuttgart that evening, taking off from different airfields in the United Kingdom, making their way into German aerospace. Although the weather was fine in England, Stuttgart was covered in clouds, so the pathfinders could not find the city's industrial center and market very well. Most bombs hit the southern parts of the city. They destroyed 88 houses, damaged another 334, killing 28 people and injuring another 71. A small raid and not that successful either. From 76 Squadron, 6 Halifax with crews took part in the attack, but only 5 of them reached their targets. According to the operational record book of the squadron, though, navigation and timing was of the very highest standard and extensive fires were left burning. For one of the minor allies of Churchill's great alliance, Norway, this was, however, in some respects, a very special evening. 2 of the aircraft from 76 Squadron were captained by Norwegian airmen, and both of those aircraft also had Norwegian navigators. Lieutenants Gunnar Halle and Bjørn Næss, shown here, captained each of those Halifax with Halvard Wikolt and Bjarne Innseth as navigators. Together with Eirik Sandberg and Kåre Stenvik, who didn't fly that evening though, these were the 6 first Norwegians who joined 76 Squadron and the first 6 Norwegians to fly with Bomber Command then. Both the Norwegian crews successfully reached Stuttgart and sent their deadly cargo down towards it on this night from a height of around 10,000 feet. All 6 aircraft of the 76 Squadron returned safely to base on that night. This was the first time then during the Second World War that Norwegian airmen participated in a retaliation against Germany by bombing a target in Germany. And these 6 people then were the first ones to do that. From the ORB of the squadron, they even mentioned their new Norwegian members from the High North, stating that we were able to welcome for the first time the appearance of 2 of our Norwegian captains, Lieutenant Næss and Halle. This was their first trip, and in spite of its distance, 1,500 miles, they both completed it with outstanding success. Let me then address the theme of this lecture before I move on. And I want to mention before I begin that what you get today is my September 2022 version. Luckily for me, I'm a historian, and luckily for us historians, one can never say that this is the final version. So this Norwegians in Bomber Command is a team I'm still researching. And we are not really sure about the numbers either. Most sources say about 60 Norwegians. My counting as of today is that it was 59 Norwegians who flew bomber aircraft within Bomber Command during the war, of whom 35 lost their lives and 4 became German prisoners of war. And I must admit that it feels a bit awkward, though, to stand here in London, quite close to the memorial of those 125,000 men who served in Bomber Command throughout the war, of whom over 55,000 lost their lives. Talking about the Norwegian war effort with 59 men who served within that force. There were men and women from 62 nations serving with or servicing Bomber Command operations during the Second World War. Since the Norwegian contribution was so small compared to other nations, it feels a bit absurd to speak about one of these nations, and indeed only 59 men then, especially if you look at the war from an international perspective. Countries like Canada, who supplied a whole group to Bomber Command, and Australia, New Zealand, Poland, and France, who all had their own bomber squadrons within Bomber Command, participated at greater strength and with greater loss than the Norwegians. So why then tell the story of those 59 men of the coming from one of the smaller allies? Personally, I'm a Norwegian, of course, and I do think that their story and its political undertones, at least, is interesting for several reasons. So please bear with me. I am interested in this theme since almost no scholarly work has been done on neither the Norwegian war policy, on the participation in Bomber Command, nor on the experiences of these men or their fate. As Harry mentioned, in sharp contrast, a lot has been written about the 4 Norwegian squadrons established within the RAF, 2 of them fighter squadrons and 2 maritime squadrons. So in this lecture, I will just try to do both these things. Firstly, I will try to explain how and why a rather reluctant Norwegian ally at the beginning of the war eventually began sending personnel to participate in the most controversial of operations during the war, the bombing of Germany by the forces of RAF's Bomber Command. That Norwegian forces and Norwegian airmen in particular should participate in the Allied war effort on the continent had not been a straightforward case. But as I will explain, the participation within Bomber Command was almost like a dream come true for the leadership of the 2 Norwegian air forces. The second thing I will try to do today is I will try to give you some impression of who the Norwegian bomber crews were. I will touch upon the history of some of them. As with the rest of the personnel of Bomber Command, they were all volunteers. Service was voluntary for all these 59 men. Why did they join? How did they cope with the extreme stress of the missions and the knowledge that a lot of them would lose their lives? And what about the survivors? How did they cope with the scars of war? I'll try to address all these questions. Let me then briefly just start with the beginning of the war for Norway. For one of Europe's northernmost countries, the war began as a surprise on the 9th of April 1940, when Nazi Germany attacked both Denmark and Norway in a surprising attack. Some 7 months earlier, as Germany had invaded Poland and the Second World War had started, Norway had declared neutrality. The hope was to make sure that Norway stayed out of the war, as they had done some 25 years earlier during the First World War. The Germans, however, decided otherwise. It was the Germans who brought Norway into the Second World War. And Norway entered the war with 2 air arms, one for the army and one for the navy. Both were small. The bulk of their equipment was surely outdated. As an example, the army had only 9 fighter aircraft, not 9 fighter squadrons, but 9 fighter aircraft on the 9th of April. The British-built Cluster Gladiator. The main aircraft in the Army Air Force was the Fokker CV, of which they had about 40. The Fokker was mainly a reconnaissance plane, the first ones manufactured in the mid-20s. It was clearly outdated as well. During the campaign in Norway then, British and French forces tried to come to the rescue of Norway, but especially during the campaign in southern Norway, this was poorly planned, poorly executed. Here represented with 18 Gloucester Gladiators of RAF's 263 Squadron that tried to establish a base at the frozen lake, Lesjaskogsvatnet. But they were attacked the day after they had landed by German air forces, and most aircraft were destroyed on the ice the day after. A catastrophic attempt, actually. And although the fighting in southern Norway was effectively over in 3 weeks' time or something like that, Norwegian and Allied forces recaptured the industrial town of Narvik in the high north from the Germans in late May, thus inflicting actually the first loss upon the Germans in the whole war. The small Norwegian Army Air Arm unit did some fine work up there with Fokkers mainly, and in addition, the 263 squadron of RAF obtained new aircraft and operated with good effect or good results from Bardufoss during that campaign. But soon, the Allies withdrew also from northern Norway in the beginning of June 1940, since there were more pressing issues on the agenda, both for the French and the British. The Germans, of course, had invaded the Low Countries and France with considerable success, and faced with the possibility of having to fight the Germans on their own, the Norwegian forces in the north sued for an armistice. So the king and the Crown Prince Olav, King Haakon VII and Crown Prince Olav, and the government fled Norway aboard HMS Devonshire on the 7th of June 1940, 35 years to the day since Norway gained its independence from Sweden. They had been invited to the UK by the British government. Aboard the same ship was also some of the men that had fought in northern Norway, amongst them a small unit of the Army Air Arm with 24 men. And by the end of the campaign in Norway in June 1940, there was almost nothing left of the two small Norwegian Air Arms, except for around 60 airmen of different categories that had fled to Great Britain. Almost half of them pilots. Here you see another bunch of them. The picture is not that good, but in the middle here is Bjarne Øen, who became their leader, especially for the Army Air Arm then, and he became also central in shaping the Norwegian Air Arms policy in exile during the summer of 1940. And in short, this policy was to try to create separate and identifiable Norwegian units within the RAF. Norwegian airmen were not allowed to enter the RAF individually. The aim was to try to show that Norway was fighting on, that Norway did participate in the war, and although its country was occupied and its authorities were partly in exile, Norway as a country did fight on. So these Norwegian units could represent the Norwegian exile government then, and build parts of its somewhat shaken legitimacy in parts of Norwegian society. And if these goals were to be reached of identifiable Norwegian units, they needed more personnel than the 60 men they had. They therefore had to build competence. And after trying to establish a school or something similar on the British Isles, it was decided that the Norwegians should go to Canada to establish a training camp for both Norwegian Air Arms there. And so they did. The two Norwegian Air Arms established a common training facility in Toronto, Canada. The name was Royal Norwegian Air Forces Training Camp, but it's more it rose to fame under its more common name, Little Norway. At Little Norway, then, the Norwegians followed the standard RAF educational system. In May 1942, the camp was moved a bit to the north in Canada, and in February 1945 moved to RAF Winkley, across the Atlantic, then to RAF Winkley in Devon. So by the end of the war, some 2,500 personnel had been trained at Little Norway. Most of them, of course, Norwegian, but a few Danes and Swedes as well, both ground crew and pilots for different duties, with mostly the Norwegian squadrons within the RAF then. In the meantime, the Norwegian military staff and naval staff established themselves in London together with the Norwegian government. So during the autumn of 1940, as Little Norway was established in Canada, the small Norwegian Army Air Arm and Navy Air Arm dealt separately with questions of their, by this time, non-existing air arms then. A few misunderstandings and differing viewpoints had, however, surfaced, highlighting the problems of having two air arms. So the Norwegian exile government therefore established a joint air command for both air forces in March 1941. Hjalmar Riise-Larsen a very famous polar pilot and naval officer, was appointed chief of the new command, with the earlier mentioned Bjarne Øen of the Army Air Arm as chief of staff. The establishment of the Joint Air Command signaled the independent status of the Norwegian Air Arms with both the Norwegian exile government and within the RAF. The new command in practice achieved a status as a third Norwegian service alongside the Army and the Navy. Its commander reported directly to the Norwegian Defense Ministry. The new command was also appreciated by the RAF, who began coordinating directly with it. At first sight, this did not seem as an important change in Norwegian policy. Few historians have taken any interest in this reorganization, instead focusing on the Norwegian squadrons that were established from April 1941 and onwards. I will, however, argue that the creation of this Joint Air Command put Riise Larsen and his staff in a more prominent position within the Norwegian exile authorities. From that position, they tried to influence Norwegian policy in a more activistic direction during the war, making the Norwegian participation as broad and as aggressive as possible. I will return to this argument in a bit. But before that, let me just address for a second that the Øen's policy from the summer of 1940 also succeeded of having these Norwegian units within the RAF. 330 Norwegian Squadron was the first one, flying maritime aircraft from Iceland, established in April 1941, and in July 1941, the first Norwegian fighter squadron, 331 Norwegian Squadron, was established at RAF Catterick in Yorkshire. But let me then do a jump in time. This was the spring of 1941. In August 1942, these two men met. The Chief of Staff of the Norwegian Joint Air Command, Lieutenant Colonel Birger Fredrik Motzfeldt, met with Air Marshal Arthur Harris, the commander of Bomber Command, since February the same year. In that meeting, they agreed that Norwegian airmen could join Bomber Command voluntarily and as individuals. In the first batch, as I've shown you, there should be 6 men, 3 pilots and 3 navigators. The Norwegian thought it best that these men were somewhat experienced, so they were mainly chosen from the small Norwegian unit within Ferry Command that had been established in 1941. From then on, everything happened rather quickly, as I opened this lecture with telling you that the first mission was flown already the same autumn of 1942. It took place only a couple of months later. The main reason for this was that the 6 Norwegians were experienced and did not have to attend any operational training unit, which was normally required for aircrew within the RAF educational system. We do not know for sure who took the initiative to this meeting between Harris and Motzfeldt. It seems, however, likely that the initiative came from the Norwegians, offering 6 new airmen to Harris, quite a small number. Motzfeldt himself wrote to the Air Ministry earlier the same month requesting this meeting as well. What we do know, however, was that the leader of the Norwegian Joint Air Command, Hjalmar Riise Larsen, had been an eager supporter of a Norwegian bomber squadron within the RAF since the summer of 1940. Already in an aide memoir written from Norwegian to British authorities in September 1940, signed by Riise Larsen, the Norwegians signaled that their ambition was to establish 1 unit of bombers within the RAF. The bomber unit should consist of 12 aircraft. Possibly they thought about light bombers, I would suggest, like the Hudson, for instance. And Riise Larsen probably also wanted to use them against the German occupying forces in Norway and not as part of Bomber Command per se. We find another example in the letter from Riise Larsen to Allied air chiefs written in June 1941. There is summed up the Norwegian war effort thus far and repeated his desire for a Norwegian bomb unit. He although acknowledged in that letter from June 1945 that a full squadron of bombers was a task that will take a very long time to be able to establish. It also seems quite likely that the ambition of the Joint Air Command for a separate Norwegian bomber unit, at least in the short term, somewhere in 1942, was transformed into an ambition to send separate crew members to Bomber Command then. Until this moment, in August 1942 and the meeting I mentioned, the Joint Air Command had quite strictly adhered to the policy from 1940 of sending Norwegian airmen to build identifiable Norwegian units. There were a few Norwegians serving within other squadrons of the RAF, but they were sent there to build competence to build Norwegian units then. This policy of identifiable Norwegian units was abandoned for the sake of sending Norwegians to Bomber Command. Probably because the Joint Air Command, the Norwegian Joint Air Command, then understood that the bomber squadron was beyond what they could manage to recruit and build regarding the number of personnel that you needed for a whole bomber squadron. We do not know exactly how this happened, but the probable version of events is somewhat like this. In June 1942, Arthur Harris addressed the Norwegian people in a radio address broadcasted by the Norwegian branch of the BBC 2 months before the meeting. After Harris's speech, which Elise Larsen liked very much, Elise Larsen wrote a personal letter to Harris praising him for his speech. In that letter, Elise Larsen again repeated this ambition of bombers directly to Harris. Here is the letter. I'm not sure if this is readable, but from the second sentence, and I'll read it out to you. For 2 years, I have unsuccessfully been advocating for the establishment of a Norwegian bomber squadron. We have so much to revenge for the annihilated villages in Norway. We would be proud to be under your command. And underlined, can you help us, please? Reading through, I have to admit several thousand sources from the Second World War. This is a rather unusual way to send a formal letter, although it was written personally from Elise Larsen to Harris. Nevertheless, it seems likely that this letter from July 1942 led to the meeting of August, where it was decided that Norwegian aircrew in Norwegian uniform and paid by Norwegian authorities could join Bomber Command. The Norwegians should volunteer, of course, as was the case with all men serving in Bomber Command. And as I mentioned earlier, there were tensions within the Norwegian exile authorities regarding where and how Norwegian forces should be used during the war. Elise Larsen and the Joint Air Command represented what we can term an activistic line, arguing that Norway ought to be fully integrated within the Allied war effort, and that Norwegian forces thus ought to be put to use in the war effort instantly and without any geographical restrictions. A formal milestone in this respect of the companionship between the two countries, so to speak, had been reached in May 1941 with the signing of the military treaty between the United Kingdom and Norway. The treaty was based on similar treaties with other allies that the British had signed. One could argue that the military treaty of May 1945, signed by both the British and Norwegian Foreign Secretary, as you see, settled this tension within the Norwegian government, but it did not. The main question underlying the tension was whether the Norwegian military exile forces were to be used only for the recapture of Norway or also for the Allied fight in general. The formulation within the treaty it states like this, that they should be used either for the defense of the United Kingdom or for the purpose of regaining Norway. So then you solve the tension, but not really. There were two aspects of this formulation that still created tensions. Firstly, there were disagreements within the exile authorities whether Norwegian forces should participate actively within the alliance or if they were to be spared for the regaining of Norway. There were elements of the exile authorities that argued that eagerly that you had to spare your forces in case of a possible campaign to recapture Norway then, especially since a potential regaining of Norway without any Norwegian forces would create problems for the exile government's legitimacy. This line of reasoning won the day for parts of the Norwegian exile forces, especially the army. They built a whole brigade in Scotland during the war, but only very small parts of it saw any action. It was spared for a potential campaign in Norway, which never appeared. The second debatable question aspect of the formulation from the military treaty was what the defense of the United Kingdom actually meant in practice. Did it mean only defensive measures against German forces that attacked the United Kingdom, or also participation in offensive operations over Europe? Riise Larsen and the Joint Air Command was quite clear in their response to both these questions. Here from a letter to the Defense Ministry in March 1942. When it comes to the defense of the United Kingdom, it is the Joint Air Command's view that the best defense is attack. Personnel of the Norwegian Air Forces is therefore also, as far as possible, made available for our British allies for offensive purposes outside the territory of the United Kingdom. Several sources suggest that there were ongoing discussions amongst the Norwegian authorities, both political and military, on this issue, but that those who were of the opinion that offensive operations were conducted in the defense of the United Kingdom, and that such offensive operations also would contribute to the regaining of Norway, won the day, at least from the spring of 1942 and onwards. A similar shift in policy was seen in the use of the two Norwegian fighter squadrons in the same period. They were transferred, both of them were transferred south to an airbase just north of London here, North Weald, near Epping, and then eventually took more and more part in the fighting across the Channel as well in the same period. So how did this change come about? We do not know for sure, but the Joint Air Command probably played their part. As shown, they were eagerly pushing for more active participation in the war. At least as important was probably a change in two central positions within the exiled Norwegian government. Trygve Lie, who became foreign minister already in November 40 and was from the Norwegian side very central in the military treaty from May 1941, was one of them. The other change in government was the change of defense minister. The once pacifist Oscar Torp, who had changed his mind on that subject already in the 1930s, took over as defense minister from November 1941 and stood for a more active line. We have no concrete sources that states that Torp supported sending Norwegian personnel to Bomber Command, but it is a reasonable view from my perspective that he would have stopped it if he didn't like it. Without these changes within government, especially Torp, the Joint Air Command's advice could have and possibly would have been disregarded. So a practical consequence of this change in policy in the spring of 1942 was that the Joint Air Command, with the acceptance of the Norwegian Defense Ministry, probably could go about recruiting aircrew to service with Bomber Command. So then let me move on to the second part of my lecture here today to talk about the Norwegian airmen who join Bomber Command. This is, by the way, Halle and Mikol's crew. Halle is to the right here. You see they have different uniforms as well. Halle to the right and Mikol number 4 from the right then. A picture taken just before their 30th mission in the spring of 1943. First, I have to say that I, among the 59 men, do not include the Norwegians who flew night fighters in 85 Squadron, which during the summer of 1944 also was part of Bomber Command for a period of time. Nor do I include the 7 Norwegians who flew with 161 Special Duty Squadron at Tempsford Air Base. This squadron was formerly a part of Bomber Command, but they were mostly tasked by the Air Ministry directly, and they did not fly bomber aircraft, although they flew similar aircraft, but their job was dropping agents and equipment into occupied Europe. With these men included, the number of Norwegians who flew with Bomber Command would probably rise to somewhere in the upper 60s or something like that, and not the 59. But of the allies within the RAF, Norway obtained a fairly independent status. They were allowed by the British to have their own independent training camp in Canada. They had an air command, although mainly dealing with administrative tasks and Norwegian specific policies. And last but not least, all Norwegian airmen, I think with only 1, 2, or maybe 3 exceptions, enlisted with the Norwegian Armed Forces and not with the RAF or its voluntary reserve. So who were the Norwegian bomber crews then? A quick reply to that question is that they were Norwegian airmen. Although they were integrated as any other member of Bomber Command, they wore Norwegian uniforms and got their salary from Norway. That salary was a bit higher than the regular British, and they even got an additional income based on flying hours as well. So quite a few of the Norwegians had an active pre-war commission, or were reservists from before the war, which also raised their salary. And Knut Lindost, one of the youngest Norwegian skippers, 22-year-old, he even divided his extra flying pay between his crew then, because he was the only Norwegian on that crew. In the words of Max Hastings, they therefore became the richest crew on the squadron. And bear over with me on this quite long quote from Hastings, but he has written about the Norwegians in his classic work, Bomber Command. And I quote, 76 was an exceptionally international squadron, even by the standards of Bomber Command. Its little group of Norwegian aircrew added a distinctive character and an underpinning of fierce determination. They had come to England to fight, and they were single-mindedly dedicated to doing so. The Norwegians never cared about the economic importance of a target, said one of the 76's CEOs in 1943. They just wanted to know how many Germans per acre. They lived in their own private world, not because they were unfriendly, but because their experience set them a dimension apart from the young English colleagues. The Norwegians were more serious, less playful in the mess. They flew with Norwegian flags pinned in the cockpits. They clustered together in their strange forage caps. They seldom turned back early from an operation, whatever technical trouble their aircraft developed. And Hastings is, of course, correct when it comes to 76 Squadron as a more Norwegian squadron than most others. Of the 59 Norwegians, at least 25 of them flew at some time or another with 76 Squadron, thus giving the squadron, at least for parts of the war, a certain Norwegian flavor. In addition, the Norwegians were older than the regular bomber crew, possibly meaning that they were more mature than the younger men. The average age of the 35 Norwegians who were killed in training or operations with Bomber Command was a bit over 26 years. The average age of aircrew of Bomber Command was 21. One could, of course, say that these were regular Norwegian young men, but that is not true either. First and foremost, most Norwegian young men aged 18 to 30 somewhat did not go to Canada and then back to England to fight the Germans during the war. These were dedicated men, eager to join the fighting and eager to fly. It also seems as though quite a few of them were better educated than the average Norwegian young man of that time. Here were aerospace engineers, chemical engineers, and even a lawyer. Especially for the pilots and navigators, the educational level was clearly above average in Norway at that time, and possibly also in Bomber Command. There were also quite a high number of pilots among the Norwegians who joined Bomber Command. One reason for this was the relatively high age and also high educational level of the Norwegian. To the best of my current knowledge, then, 26 of the 59 men were pilots, about 45%. And I would suggest that the average in Bomber Command were something like 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, maybe 20%. Another explanation is that other categories of Norwegian airmen were stopped from getting a posting to Bomber Command. Quite famously, when the Air Ministry visited North Weald, where the fighter squadrons were deployed, the wing commander there, Lieutenant Colonel Helge Mere, stopped a recruiting address from the Air Ministry. They were trying to recruit new members to Bomber Command from the Norwegian ground personnel, and Helge Mere would have none of this because he had too few ground personnel as it was. And most men wanted to join up for this meeting, but they were not allowed, and they were denied such a posting then. The Norwegian loss rate was also a bit higher than the average of Bomber Command. There were, as mentioned, 35 Norwegian aircrew killed, a loss rate of about 59% compared to 44% for Bomber Command as a whole. For the Norwegians with the Pathfinder force, the statistics are even grimmer. A total of 15 Norwegians serving with the Pathfinders, only 4 survived, a loss rate of 73% then. Whether this higher Norwegian loss rate is accidental or not is, however, almost impossible to find out. But if Hastings is correct, the loss rate could be a consequence of the willingness to take risks. Another factor could be the high proportion of pilots. There are many examples of other crew members jumping out of aircraft in trouble while the pilot went down with his plane. This picture then illustrates almost all of these arguments. It is taken in 1935, actually, and in my hometown, and shows 3 Norwegian pilots on a hiking trip, of whom 2 would die during the war. They all flew with Bomber Command. At the time, all 3 were doing their yearly month-long service. They were all reservists then with the Army Air Corps. It shows First Lieutenants Olav Bakke-Stene, Johan Koren Christi, and Bjørn Næss on a hiking trip to Gråkallen, for those who are locally informed. Stene, who first served as a pilot instructor in Little Norway in Canada, was later to fly Mosquitoes with Bomber Command, but he was killed in an accident while training at 13 OTU in July 1943. Christi, in the middle, who was educated as an aerospace engineer at the university in Berlin from 1930 to 35, and even received further education there from 38 to 39, flew with the Pathfinder Force in 35 Squadron on at least 45 missions with Bomber Command and survived the war. The third man is Bjørn Næss. He was amongst the first 6 Norwegians to join Bomber Command, as mentioned, with 76 Squadron, and was killed on operations in January 1943, the first Norwegian killed in operations with Bomber Command. The 3 men's age when they joined Bomber Command was respectively 30, 33, and 32 years of age. A few sources also, especially when it comes to the assessments of the first 6 aircrew that were sent to 76 Squadron, regard them very highly. Here in the words of the legendary Leonard Cheshire, then a wing commander commanding 76 Squadron, he regarded Gunnar Holle and Bjørn Næss, the 2 first pilots, very highly, stating that they were amongst the best pilots he had ever had, and recommended strongly that they were promoted. In March 1944, a bit later than this, Air Marshal Harris himself took the time to write to Riise Larsen, since Harris felt that it had taken too long time to award a DFC to Johan Koren Christi, who I've just had the picture of here. Since Norwegian authorities had used 5 months to accept the DFC to Christi, Harris was a bit upset and stated in that letter that Christi is one of the finest pilots and most efficient captains I have in the Pathfinder Force. And that is saying a lot. And Christi, of course, got his DFC then, and also a war cross with sword from the Norwegian government. As with other aircrew with Bomber Command, the experiences of the Norwegian aircrew were of comradeship in extremely dangerous situations, and the feeling of sharing a strong commitment to the rest of the crew. This commitment, of course, stemmed from the situation they all understood they were in. The members of a crew were all dependent on each other. In few other environments where 6 or 7 men are present at the same time, is the Musketeer slogan, one for all for one, more appropriate. Adding to this, they were all volunteers, of course, tying their fate even more together than if they had been ordered or forced to serve in such perilous situations. Some men even calculated their risks and just waited to meet their destiny. Others seemed to almost have accepted that they probably would die, but that they in the meantime should do what they could to retaliate against the Germans. Most of them also accepted the risk. They fought, of course, with fright, but in some way or other, most of them managed to live through it, exposing themselves repeatedly to danger. The young Norwegian skipper, Knut Lindås, who I've shown a photo earlier, only 22 years of age, wrote a letter to his family through his aunt in Sweden in November 1943, in which he wrote, it's my translation though, "It is possible that you won't like the content of this letter. I must say that this work has no future to it. I haven't lived long, but long enough to see what is worth seeing. If I am to perish, I just want to say that I am happy to give my life for a cause that heals the world and make sure that there is peace on earth." Lindås died 12 days later, as his aircraft ended up in a dangerous situation with ice. Lindos made sure that the rest of the crew were able to bail out or jump out, but he did not manage to do that himself before the plane crashed. Lindos was posthumously given the War Cross with Sword, the highest Norwegian decoration for his bravery. In short, I actually do think that the experience of the 59 Norwegians flying with Bomber Command do not differ from that of a British or other Allied bomber crew. And if that is correct, I think that's a huge compliment to the RAF and the rest of British society. After some hesitation regarding all its new allies during the chaotic spring and summer months of 1940, the RAF became great hosts for their Allied partners. The Norwegians who survived their service with Bomber Command have, without exception, spoken highly about the way they were treated by the RAF. Here you have Christie again, who in his memoirs wrote, "When I look back to my time in the RAF, I can certainly state that one of the finest things we experienced was the good and rather relaxed comradeship between superior and subordinates, and amongst men from all classes of society, from many different countries and many different backgrounds." It also seems that a lot of the Norwegians in exile were more Norwegian and nationalistic than ever. The fact that their motherland was occupied and the people of Norway suppressed by a brutal occupation regime possibly created a view of the home country they had left that was more romantic than before. A lot of the Norwegian crews had different ways to pay tribute to all things Norwegian then, even though Halle and Wikolt, as I've shown earlier, were the only two Norwegians with their crew. They painted the Norwegian flag on their aircraft. The navigator Kåre Stenvik, who I also mentioned, carried in his pocket on all 69 missions this small Norwegian flag that he had received during his participation in the campaign in Norway, actually. And he brought this flag with him, and it's still in the family's possession. So why did they join? We do not know for certain why the Norwegian aircrew volunteered to join Bomber Command. It is, however, quite clear that revenge and the possibility of participating in some sort of retaliation against the Germans motivated quite a few of them. As Kåre Stenvik, one of the first six then, stated in his memoirs, finally there will be some action. Now I might get the opportunity to let the Germans taste their own medicine. As we have seen as well, Max Hastings more than suggests that the Norwegians with 76 Squadron were properly motivated and also willing to take more risk than other crews. Other sources seem to confirm this theory. It even existed within the Norwegian Joint Air Command. Here, from letters written by Motzfeldt and Risa Larsen to Air Vice Marshal Carr, COC, number 4 group of Bomber Command. From a quote from Risa Larsen, and we are all grateful that you have given us the opportunity to pay back some of our debts to the Germans. Or, in the words of Motzfeldt, since the spring of 1940, we have always wished to use every opportunity to repay the Germans for what they did to our country, and certainly number 4 group, especially number 76 Squadron, has given us this opportunity, so we have repaid with interest. Their missions and their potentially controversial targets, especially the residential areas of civilian Germans, do not seem to have troubled any of the Norwegians, despite the fact that they knew quite clearly that on quite a lot of the missions were attacking civilians in residential areas. Jon Magne Stene, a Norwegian skipper with 76 Squadron, stated in a documentary 50 years after his service with Bomber Command, he was a flight lead with 76 Squadron, the only Norwegian flight lead. I must say that I have no trouble with my consciousness about what we did. They had started the war, and now they themselves got to feel what they had begun. Johan Koren Christie was a bit more nuanced in his memoirs, although he also saw himself as very proud and rational during the war. Here in his memoirs, we were proud to be able to join in the fighting. We felt that we contributed positively to the great and difficult game. It might seem strange to others, but after a number of trips, I noted with great satisfaction that the huge investments laid down in my crew and me had paid off in destruction. I'm not very proud of this today, but under the circumstances we at that time lived and worked, such a mindset was neither unnatural nor irrational. Later in life, however, Christie saw things a bit differently. It was first long after the war had ended, when I got the time to read and think through what we had done more deeply, that I found out that we had acted in conflict with the laws of war, and that we had participated in what can be termed a war crime. And he continued that our attacks on the German cities, according to analysis conducted after the war, did not contribute to the victory as much as we had thought, and frequently were being told, was naturally also a big disappointment to those of us who had risked our lives participating in this bombing campaign. And quite a lot had not only risked it, they had lost their lives. Few parts of the Second World War have been and still are as controversial as the bombing campaign, especially the campaign waged by Bomber Command against German cities, industry, and the German civilian population. In a brilliant literature review essay, historian Andrew Knapp has concluded like this: the bombing war has remained the most contentious aspect of Britain's World War II record. It has been contentious above all because of the gulf between the exceptional courage of the young men who served in Bomber Command and the horror that they inflicted on the German population. To celebrate the bravery of the aircrew is to belittle the suffering of the civilians who died. To state clearly that the bombing offensive violated the laws and norms by which civilized human beings wage war diminishes the courage of the aircrew. I'm not here, of course, to discuss the British debate on these aspects, although I find Knapp's argument very convincing. In 2022, I personally think that it is possible to do both things at the same time. Acknowledge the story of incredibly dedicated and courageous young men in extreme danger, pushing through dense defensive systems, doing what might be termed the toughest and most risky mission during World War II. And at the same time, acknowledge the immense suffering of the German civilian population because these young men did what they were ordered to do. My point here today, however, is that the Norwegian participation in the campaign, except for the small quotations from Kåre and Christie's memoirs, has not been a subject to controversy in Norway at all. The literature within the field of Norwegians in Bomber Command is either anecdotical or autobiographical, and there are no signs of any controversy regarding the bomber offensive. One example of this is found in the title of Stenvik's book, a good book, but the title is interesting here regarding controversy. This is in Norwegian then, but I'll translate. It just reads, "We bombed Nazi Germany." Straightforward and correct, of course. There has never been any debate, to my knowledge, about the morality of the Norwegian participation in the bombing campaign then. Let me then address shortly the scars of war. So what then about the scars of their experience, what we today know as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? The only one of the memoirs written by Norwegian aircrew that touches upon this subject is Carl Ludvig Larsen's memoir, Through Fire and Water. He mentions nightmares that appeared after some years. This is not at all, however, a central theme in Larsen's book. It is only mentioned once. I have not yet begun to work on this aspect fully, but it is possible to assume that since these men had been in extremely dangerous situations, it would be strange if none of them had any problems after the war. We do also know that many other categories of personnel with experiences of frontline service, for instance, men of the Norwegian Merchant Navy then, experienced post-war trauma and various psychological problems. One might argue, of course, that since the aircrew of Bomber Command actively participated in the war and in some circumstances were able to influence their own situation, at least to a certain degree, they may have less problems with PTSD than other personnel categories. Another point in that respect is, of course, that they were all volunteers as well. A third argument is that the airmen felt that the moral argument behind their operations was solid. After seeing how the Germans operated, the aircrew felt that what they did was necessary. A final argument is, of course, that the aircrew did not observe closely the results of what they were doing. Since they attacked at night as well, and from the height of maybe 10,000 feet, they would obviously not be able to see the suffering they inflicted on the German civilian population. The physical distance from the target could also create some sort of moral distance then to one's actions. But bear in mind that when it comes to the bomber crews and their possible PTSD reactions, my research has only just begun. Let me then just begin to sum up and conclude. As peace came to Norway in May 1945, the Royal Norwegian Air Force in exile, which had become a third service in the armed forces in November 1944, counted about 2,700 men and women, officers and NCOs and other ranks, almost all of them serving with the RAF or within the RAF. A few of these airmen had served at one time or another with Bomber Command, 59. Norwegian policy on whether to take part in offensive operations on and across the continent had drifted, and from 1942, Norwegians who volunteered were allowed to serve there. In absolute numbers and compared to larger nations, such as the United Kingdom or the US, however, the contribution was of course small. Norway did not win the Second World War. That was accomplished by the Grand Alliance, in which Great Britain, of course, the US and the Soviet Union played the most important roles. But it was very important, I think, especially for the Cold War that came, that also the smaller nations, such as Norway, took an active part in the war. The greatest Norwegian asset, of course, during the war was the state-controlled merchant fleet, but the Norwegian Air Force and its personnel was also an asset of the Norwegian government. In addition, the RAF had formed the Norwegian exile forces to a strong degree. The get-go spirit of the RAF, I would say, is still a part of the Norwegian Air Force's culture and history. It is, of course, almost impossible to measure what 59 aircrew meant for the totality of Bomber Command's operation. If I should try, the answer would, of course, be almost nothing. Compared to a total of 125,000 aircrew, 59 is indeed a very small number. Before I end, let me just briefly tell you how it went for these 6 men, the first 6. The skipper Erik Sandberg on your right completed his tour of 30 missions with 76 Squadron, went on to become a test pilot with both Handley Page and later de Havilland. He was awarded several Norwegian decorations for his service. The navigator Kåre Stenvik flew more than 30 missions with 76 Squadron. He then volunteered for a second round with the Pathfinder Force, posted to 35 Squadron. He showed proficiency and calmness, flew several missions in a master bomber crew. He had a total of 64 missions with Bomber Command. He was awarded Norway's highest decoration, the War Cross with Sword, and also a DFC with Bar, and had a successful career in the Norwegian Air Force after the war, from 69 until 75, commanding the Air Force. The skipper Gunnar Halle, on your left, flew more than 30 missions with 76 Squadron before he moved on to fly with 161 Special Duty Squadron, ending with a total of 55 missions over occupied Europe. Halle was, of course, also awarded the War Cross with Sword and a DFC. Halvard Wikolt, on your left there, had originally been a mechanic with the Norwegian Fighter Squadron 332. He also flew 30 missions with 76 Squadron. Wikolt later went on to become a pilot, volunteered a second time in Bomber Command, and flew another 20 missions with 166 Squadron. Wikolt was also awarded the War Cross with Sword and a DFC with Bar. So the first and the 2 ones in the middle, of course, Bjarne Inseth and Bjørn Næss, they were the first 2 Norwegians killed with on operations with Bomber Command on the 18th of January 1943 on an attack against Berlin on their 9th mission with 76 Squadron then. So the first 6 Norwegians, 4 of them actually survived the war, and 3 of them got Norway's highest decoration, the War Cross with Sword. On June the 30th, 1945 was termed Allied Victory Day in Norway's capital, and the British sent Arthur Harris on a visit to Norway to represent the British government then. And he was interviewed by Norwegian radio, and we still have that tape. And he said, he was asked if he could say something about the personnel under his command, Norwegians then. And he stated, I have had, I think, 66 Norwegian personnel in my command, of whom a large number were captains of bombers. They have indeed given us very great service, and we have great admiration for them as airmen. I haven't the figures in front of me at the moment, but I believe they have been awarded well over 20 decorations for gallantry in the field, and that speaks for itself. For Norway, and especially for the Norwegian government, the Norwegian participation, although small, was important in several respects. One of them was Norwegian self-esteem after the war, beautifully expressed by one of the Royal Norwegian Air Force's grand old men, Lieutenant General Wilhelm Mohr, fighter pilot and commander of 333 Squadron, amongst others. We Norwegians should remember that Britain stood up at a crucial time, and that it was the Allied victory that brought us our country back. But we had participated, and we should be thankful for that. Kåre Stenvik, who I mentioned several times, and who I will end this lecture with, and who flew the most missions among the Norwegian sets, has, in an epilogue to his memoirs, concluded in the same manner, but on a more personal level. I felt lucky, not only because I survived, but also since I got to participate. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, Ole, I really enjoyed that. So for our audience here, we can do question and answer session. We've also got some questions from the audience online. Just over 100 people join us. So, very, very good audience. Beyond the room, but people online can't see, but we're talking to hundreds in the room as well. I should say, if you're asking a question in the room, you need the microphone, because otherwise they won't be able to hear it. We'll just get to enjoy it, and everyone else will be scratching their heads. But I'm really pleased as well when you mentioned the Norwegian merchant service as well at the end, because I think it's often forgotten how large that contribution was. And so I wanted to ask you, do you feel, because of that scale of contribution by the merchant navy, in a way, a lot of the Norwegian effort went towards the naval war? And is that perhaps the reason the Bomber Command War is perhaps underrepresented both during the conflict and subsequently?
First of all, I think at least the Norwegian independent status within the RAF was the reason behind that status was mainly economical, actually, because the Norwegians, they paid for themselves during the whole war. And the reason for this was, of course, the Norwegian merchant navy that had been put under state control already on the 10th of April, if I remember correctly, of 1940. So the Norwegian exile government had quite good finances during the whole war. So that was the reason behind the rather independent status within the RAF. As I mentioned also, they even paid their own aircrew within Bomber Command. And of course, the Norwegian Navy Air Arm, with Riise Larsen as the boss in the beginning of the war, was very into maritime operations, but that was mostly on the coast of Norway, trying to do something about the German and the use of the Norwegian coastline then, and also trying to bring in agents, both for the SIS and the SOE. So I do think that they are. You can't couple the Norwegian merchant navy and the maritime things, or not least the maritime air squadrons. The RAF decided that the first Norwegian squadron were to be put on Iceland, which some parts of the Norwegian government did not like.
Yeah, no, I don't think I'd like to be in Iceland or either. Do we have any questions in the room? Or, okay. Well, I'm going to say we do have very active questions online. Look them up. So usually I just look at the computer, but I have to run between them. So I've written some of them down. So Darren Little has asked, are there any memorials to the Norwegians and Bomber Command personnel in Britain? And I suppose also, are there any in Norway?
To the best of my knowledge, there are none in Britain, but I'm not sure of this. There is a memorial for all Norwegian airmen who lost their lives during the Second World War. It's at the Akershus Festning or fortress in Oslo, a very nice memorial. and the name of the Norwegian air crew that lost their lives during the war is on that memorial. But it's not a bomber command or for the air crew of bomber command type of thing. It's for all Norwegian air crew that lost their lives during the Second World War.
There is one in France for the crew.
Yeah, that's correct.
That's about the only one I know of.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that is correct, because there's a Pathfinder crew that was the Norwegian, the largest loss of a Norwegian air crew during the Second World War was on the 7th of June, 1944, maybe on the 6th, in the morning of the 6th, on the Lancaster. I think there were 5 Norwegian air crew on board. The pilot was Norwegian as well, and there's one memorial there. It's quite new, 2017, 18, something like that, in a small French village where their aircraft crashed. And there's a memorial in Copenhagen, a very small one though, for one of the Norwegian navigators who flew with I can't remember the squadron now. He flew Mosquitoes, and he was a Jew as well. So the rest of his family perished during the Holocaust, but he had fled and he flew with a British squadron, and he lost his life in quite close to Copenhagen, quite late in the war. Herman Becker was his name. There's a beautiful book written about him.
I should just say, if I don't see you when you're asking a question, just start throwing things at me. My blind side. Okay, so we've got another one also from Darren, actually, which is, was the Norwegian Bomber Command contribution solely limited to Europe? And I think it was.
Yes.
You've said.
Yes, it was.
Okay, good.
Yes. One thing I didn't mention was that, quite interesting, was that after, I think it was Holland Vicolt participated in a raid on Torino in Italy, and Norway hadn't declared war on Italy. The Norwegian government hesitated a bit about this fact and when they found out. So next time a Norwegian crew member were to fly on an Italian target, then they wore a British insignia.
That's very interesting.
A pragmatic way to solve that problem.
That actually links really nicely to this next question, which is, did the Norwegian military put any limitations on identification when these crews were fighting? And the question in particular is about whether or not they were captured and found to have connections to Norway. And I suppose there's a broader consequence as well.
Yes. But no, I don't know about that, actually. I don't. Some have stated, and Max Hastings as well, is that Lindos, whom I mentioned, actually went down with his aircraft on purpose, that he had the possibility to jump out himself then. He was the only one of the crew who died. The rest got out. But I'm not sure. And the reason for this was that Lindos's brother was part of the Norwegian resistance home in Norway. And that Lindos knew what awaited him if he became a German prisoner of war. But I think that's a bit speculative, I have to say. Also, since Lindos's brother wasn't arrested at that moment when Lindos died. So I wouldn't know if there was any other strings attached to the Norwegian participation in Bomber Command, except for the fact, of course, that Norwegians were not allowed either to participate in the campaign in the Pacific after the,
Okay, excellent. And then Ewan Grant has asked, how were captured Norwegian crews treated by the Germans compared to, say, Commonwealth crews when they were taken?
I think they were treated just the same, actually. They weren't treated as anything special, as far as I know. They were put in the regular Stalag air or Luft, as we say in Norway, camps and treated as. And we have, of course, Per Waller had a very, very strange destiny to him. He was shot down on his first tour as a second pilot then. So first dicky tour. So he had only one mission then over. But he also fought, of course, on the 9th of April in a Gloucester Gladiator. That's a different story. But he became a prisoner of war. I do think they were treated quite okay by the Germans, actually, and compared to other, as treated as regular aircrew. Nothing special about that, as far as I know.
So one of the questions which I'm written down, so I'm sort of straining my memory because it's also not one of them out there, was how did these aircrew get to come over in the first place? How did they manage their escape?
Yeah, there were different types. Most of them in the early days then came over by a fishing boat or something like that. The men I've had on the picture at RAF Dice in I can't remember the Scottish city now, but never mind. They went over on a fishing boat, 16 men total, landing on the Shetland Isle. In May 1940, you saw the people on Devonshire. And there were several other coming over on the on fishing boats from Norway, mainly to Shetland and coming down. And there were people fleeing to Sweden and going the long way, crossing the whole world actually, through Asia, and then coming over to Little Norway and Canada and educating themselves to airmen. So you had different routes then. But most fled after, of course, the Germans occupied Norway. So after the campaign ended.
Okay, excellent. I think that's a really nice question here, which is how does the ethos, which Royal Norwegian Air Force, what's that sort of the adoption of the RAF's culture been like? Are there any sort of traditions which they still sort of observe? And they sort of messing in dinners, for instance, things like that?
Oh yes. I think first of all, the Second World War was the formative thing for the Norwegian Air Force. After all, it's from 1944, 10th of November 1944. It was created as a third service. I think the main reason for that was that the Norwegian exile government was in the UK and saw what a independent Air Force was doing then. So they created their own independent Air Force. Quite a basic argument, but I think that's the most important. The uniforms, of course, they are quite the same, because when the Norwegian Air Arm of the Army came to Canada, they had lots of different uniforms. And what to do then to dress up? They took Canadian uniforms with Norwegian insignia from the Army. So that's the reason for the stars on the Norwegian uniforms then. So we have your uniforms. We still have the basic RAF uniforms. We do mess dinners, of course, as they are taken directly from the RAF tradition. And I think as I mentioned in my lecture as well, the get-go spirit of the Norwegian Air Force, I think, comes from the Second World War and the Air Force created within the RAF. And of course, we have kept the squadron numbers as well. So the first Norwegian squadron with the F-35s is 332 Squadron, which was created during the war. 333 Squadron, which Morten has flown with, is the only squadron that has had an active mission going on since the Second World War, actually, since 1942. So we still have the squadron numbers as well from the RAF. So I think the RAF culture is very strong within the Norwegian Air Force still today.
Okay, well, I'd ask about the mess dinners, but if they are anything like the RAF ones, the chances are you don't remember them the morning after. So was the experience of the Norwegian bomber crews taken into consideration by the Norwegian Air Force after the war?
And that's a very good question. My basic answer is I don't know yet, because I haven't looked into that question. But if I can speculate a bit, it was not. And the main reason for that was that the Norwegian Air Force did not create any bomber units after the war then. Already in late 1944, they started planning for a new Air Force when they came home or when the war was over then. All the plans I have seen from the summer of 44 until the summer of 1944, or none of them, I have to say, include bomber aircraft. And they even began sending fewer people to Bomber Command as well. You could reason that you could argue that the reason for them sending fewer people to Bomber Command late in the war was that they didn't see the practical use of that experience into the new Air Force they were to create at home then. You have several other examples that they were thinking a lot about the period after the war at least the last year of the war then, in the Joint Air Command, or the new Norwegian Air Force staff, I have to say, in the late war. So I'm not sure about this, but I would suggest, although several of these people stayed on in the Air Force. Stenvik, whom I mentioned, Halle stayed on in the Air Force. Several also went to civilian airline companies. Wikold flew with the SAS. Carl Ludvig Larsen, whom I mentioned, flew with the civilian airline. So maybe a lot of their experience was used in the Air Force and in the civilian airline companies as well, but not regarding the specific bomber command experience, I wouldn't say. I do not think so.
Okay. Do we have any questions in the room? Yes.
I think you mentioned the fact that there was a slightly higher loss rate amongst Norwegian crew to British crew.
Yeah.
Could that have had anything to do with the types of aircraft they were flying? I think you particularly mentioned the Hudson, which was not a particularly effective bomber aircraft, and the Halifax, which of course we know experienced significant stability problems until Leonard Cheshire sorted them out.
Yeah, I haven't speculated on that. Regarding the Hudson, the Norwegians almost never flew the Hudson, actually. They just wanted the Hudson early on in the war. That was the reason why I mentioned that. So most Norwegians flew Halifax. A few flew the Lancaster as well, especially in the Pathfinder force then. And quite a few flew Mosquitoes, actually, also with Bomber Command then. But I haven't looked into that question. But there's quite a lot of Halifax crew members in the Norwegian, among the 59 Norwegians then. So possibly that might be a point, actually. I haven't looked into that. But to clear up the misunderstanding, there was no Norwegian Hudson bomber crews. I think only one Norwegian actually flew Hudson during the war.
Excellent. I think for a question that I was struck by the Harris involvement as well. He's always very good at talking about the United Nations. And, you know, do you find that in the Norwegian side as well? It's that he's giving it a sincere belief, or is there a propagandic element to this? And I sort of linked into that. When he comes over, that victory celebration, how important were the entire Norwegian Armed Services, but again, the RAF squadrons which contributed to sort of creating that post-war sort of culture within Norway? Yeah,
that's a very good and interesting question. Also, because Norway basically was run by the British during the summer and autumn of 1940, actually, by the British occupying forces then. Before the Norwegian, so the Norwegian air squadrons, for instance, they were part of the RAF until sometime in November 1940, before they were put under Norwegian Air Force Command, actually, several months after they had returned to Norway, actually. Harris was, as far as I know, only in Norway at this time, and on that interview he even states that that was his first visit there. I wouldn't know if he went back or something like that. When that is said, I'm quite certain that he had an active participation. There are several letters that are quite personal to Disa Larsen, and you could find that quite strange, actually, since Norway was such a small participant. But he took the time, and the letter about this award to Kuren Christi is very interesting. It's one page full of text letter, quite personal, because he thinks that decorations are a very important thing for his aircrew, and they have sent a letter to inform the Norwegian government that they think they ought to give Kuren Christi the DFC with Barden, and the Norwegian government uses 5 months to decide if this is okay or not. And Harris thinks that's a bit of a time, too long then. So it's a very personal letter, and there are several other examples of him taking a very active position towards a very small ally. You have other examples. I have to mention this since I have studied the whole of the Norwegian participation within the RAF that early on in the war, I think Churchill himself was very important in the creation of the foreign squadrons within the RAF, the Polish squadrons, the Czech, the French squadron, and even the Norwegian squadrons, because it was not mainstream thinking within the RAF that this was a wise thing to do during the summer of 1940, not at all. So I think Churchill convinced them quite clearly that this was a wise thing, not because it was the fighting force would be better in a short term, but in the long run, this was very wise for fighting the whole war. So that was his basic argument. And of course, it was a quite special argument since Britain was under such stress during the summer of 1940 then, with a possible German invasion. To take a long view in these times, it's quite special. So I think Churchill was very important, and for this small story of the 59 Norwegian men, I think Harris was quite important actually.
Yeah, when reading that letter, you put it up, that actually seems very Harris. I think he gets a very bad publicity for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And in fact, Harris Hastings' book, which is a good read, have to see it quoted, but he's really mean to Harris. And when he talks about Harris writing a letter at the end of the war to Portal, sort of describes it as being very sort of almost sycophantic. Whereas I've read it as being, he's very personal. That approach to him, can you help us? We want to get back into that. I can believe that would affect Harris quite closely, because that seems to be his sort of character as well. Have you looked at his papers at the RAF Museum?
No, I have not.
Oh, you've got to come along.
Yeah, I ought to. I ought to.
Yeah. Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Unless there are any more questions in the room, no, I think we're gonna call time. And if you could all thank Ole for what's been a fantastic lecture, I think.
Thank you.
You're still live.